The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Ethan Miller knew before he answered that something was wrong. No good news ever came at that hour. "It's Leo," said the voice on the other end. It was Leo's mother, and she was crying so hard the words barely came out. "There was an accident. He's gone, Ethan. My son is gone." Ethan sat up in the dark, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his own ears. He asked her to repeat herself, hoping he had misheard. She had not misheard. Leo Bennett, his closest friend since college, the man who had stood beside him through every hard year of his life, was dead. A car had lost control on a wet road. It was over in seconds. Ethan did not remember getting dressed. He did not remember driving to the hospital. He only remembered standing in a cold hallway under bright lights, staring at a door he was too afraid to walk through, because walking through it would make the news real. The days that followed moved like a blur of gray. There were phone calls to make, arrangements to help with, family members to comfort. Ethan did all of it in a kind of numb silence, because grief, he was learning, does not always come with tears. Sometimes it comes with a heavy stillness that sits on the chest and refuses to move. On the morning of the funeral, the sky was the color of ash. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd gathered around the grave, dressed in black, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked around at the faces he knew. Leo's parents stood near the casket, supported by relatives on either side. Cousins, uncles, aunts, old family friends. It seemed like half the town had come to say goodbye to a man who had been loved by everyone who met him. But then Ethan noticed something strange. A young woman stood apart from the rest, several steps back from the family, almost hidden behind a large tree at the edge of the cemetery. She wore a simple black coat, too thin for the cold morning air, and she held her arms tightly around herself as if trying to keep from shaking apart. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody looked at her. It was as though she were invisible, a shadow standing at the edge of a grief that everyone else seemed to share, but that no one would let her share with them. Ethan frowned. He had known Leo for almost 15 years. He thought he knew every member of Leo's family, but he did not know this woman. He watched her throughout the service. She did not step closer, even when the priest spoke the final words. She did not approach the family afterward, even as they embraced each other in long, sobbing hugs. She simply stood there, alone, watching the casket lowered into the earth with an expression of quiet, private pain that struck Ethan more deeply than any of the loud crying around him. When the crowd began to disperse, moving slowly toward their cars, the young woman turned to leave as well, walking quickly, her head down, as if she wanted to disappear before anyone noticed her. Ethan could not explain what made him follow her. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Perhaps it was something deeper, some instinct that told him this moment mattered. He crossed the wet grass, calling out gently so as not to startle her. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you." She stopped and turned, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. She had sharp, tired eyes, the kind that had seen more disappointment than a person her age should have to carry. There was a resemblance in her features that Ethan could not quite place at first, something in the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. Then it hit him. She looked like Leo. "Yes," she said, her voice guarded, ready to end the conversation before it began. "I'm Ethan," he said. "I was Leo's friend, his best friend actually, for a long time." He paused, unsure how to continue. "I don't think we've met." Something flickered across her face, a mixture of surprise and old, practiced pain. "No," she said quietly. "We haven't. I'm Mia, Leo's sister." Ethan blinked. In all the years he had known Leo, in all the conversations they had shared about family, about childhood, about the people who mattered most, Leo had never once mentioned a sister. Mia seemed to read the confusion on his face, and a tired, humorless smile touched her lips. "Half-sister," she corrected. "Different mother. It's a long story and not a very nice one. Most of the family prefers to pretend I don't exist." She glanced toward the gathering by the cars, where Leo's parents were being comforted by a crowd of relatives. "As you can see." "I had no idea," Ethan said, and he meant it. He felt a strange, sudden shame, as though he had failed his friend somehow by not knowing this. "Most people don't," Mia said. "It's fine, I'm used to it." She said the words simply, without self-pity, but there was something underneath them, a deep and old wound that she had clearly learned to hide well. I should go. Wait, Ethan said before he could stop himself. Can I at least walk you to your car? It's the least I can do. Mia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his kindness was real or simply a passing politeness that would vanish once they parted ways. Finally, she nodded just once. All right. They walked together in silence across the wet grass, past rows of old gray headstones, the cold morning air biting at their faces. Ethan wanted to ask 100 questions. Why had Leo never spoken of her? Why did the family treat her like a stranger at her own brother's funeral? But something told him this was not the moment. Grief was still too raw, too heavy in the air between them. When they reached her car, an old, small vehicle with a dent in the back door, Mia turned to him. "Thank you," she said, "for noticing me. Most people don't." He talked about family a lot, Ethan said quietly. Leo did. He always said family was everything to him. I think if he knew you were standing back there alone today, it would have broken his heart. Mia's eyes glistened, and for a moment Ethan thought she might cry. But she blinked the tears back with practiced control, the way someone does when they have taught themselves, over many years, not to fall apart in front of others. Maybe, she said softly, or maybe he simply forgot the way everyone else did. Before Ethan could respond, she got into her car and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the cemetery parking lot with a strange, aching feeling in his chest that he could not fully explain. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself thinking not only of Leo, but of the sister nobody had spoken of. He thought back through years of memories, searching for any mention of her, any clue he might have missed. And then, suddenly, it came to him. It was a memory from years ago, late one night after a hard week, when Leo had a few drinks and grew unusually quiet and reflective. They had been sitting on Ethan's porch, staring out at the dark street, when Leo suddenly said something strange. "I have a sister, you know," he had murmured almost to himself. "Younger, different mom. Family doesn't talk about her much, it's complicated." Ethan, half paying attention at the time, had asked what he meant. Leo had shrugged, staring into his glass. "Old history, my dad's mistakes. Everyone blames her for existing, which isn't fair because it wasn't her fault." He had gone quiet for a long moment before adding, so softly Ethan almost missed it, "If anything ever happens to me, look out for her, will you?" "Nobody else will." At the time, Ethan had laughed it off, told Leo that nothing was going to happen to him, that he was being dramatic after too many drinks. Leo had laughed too, and the conversation had drifted elsewhere, forgotten by morning. Until now. Ethan sat up in bed, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of grief and purpose. He had forgotten that promise completely, buried under years of ordinary life. But sitting in the dark now, remembering the lonely young woman standing behind a tree at her own brother's funeral, unseen and unwanted by the family that should have embraced her, he understood with sudden and total clarity that this was no longer something he could ignore. He did not know yet what it would mean. He did not know that this single memory, this quiet promise made on a porch years ago, would change the entire course of his life. All he knew, lying awake in the dark, was that he owed his friend one final act of loyalty. He had to find Mia Bennett again. He had to keep the promise Leo had made him swear, even if Leo himself had forgotten it by the time the sun rose the next day. Somewhere in the city, in a small apartment with peeling paint and a landlord who never fixed anything, Mia sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her funeral clothes, staring at nothing. She had buried her brother that morning, the only member of her family who had ever truly seen her, truly cared for her, without conditions or excuses. Now he was gone, and she was more alone than she had ever been in her life. She did not know that across the city, a man she had just met, a stranger with kind eyes and a gentle voice, was lying awake thinking of her. She did not know that a promise made years ago on a quiet porch was about to reach across the distance and change everything. All she knew, in that dark and silent room, was that the world felt colder than it ever had before, and she had no idea how she was going to survive what came next. 3 days after the funeral, Ethan found himself standing outside a small apartment building on the edge of town, staring up at a row of narrow windows, wondering if he was making a mistake. He had gotten Mia's address from Leo's mother, who had given it to him reluctantly, with a strange look on her face, as though she could not understand why anyone would want to seek out the family's forgotten daughter. "Why do you want to see her?" she had asked, her voice tight. Ethan had not known how to explain the porch conversation, the promise, the strange pull he felt toward righting a wrong he barely understood. So he had simply said, "Leo cared about her. I think I should check on her." Leo's mother had pressed her lips into a thin line, said nothing more, and written the address on a scrap of paper. Now standing outside the building, Ethan almost turned back twice. What if Mia thought he was strange, showing up uninvited at her home? What if she wanted nothing to do with him or with any reminder of the family that had cast her aside? But he thought of Leo's voice on the porch that night, quiet and serious in a way that was rare for him. "Look out for her. Nobody else will." He climbed the stairs and knocked on her door. It took a long moment before the door opened. Mia stood there in old jeans and a faded sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, clearly not expecting visitors. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Ethan," she said, "what are you doing here?" "I hope this isn't strange," he said. "I got your address from Leo's mother. I wanted to see how you were doing." Mia's expression shifted, guarded again the way it had been at the cemetery. "Why?" she asked, not unkindly but genuinely curious. "You barely know me." Ethan hesitated. He could have made something up, some polite excuse about friendship or common decency, but something about her honesty made him want to match it. "Because Leo asked me to," he said. "A long time ago, before any of this happened, he told me if anything ever happened to him, I should look out for you. I forgot about it until the funeral, until I saw you standing there alone." For a long moment, Mia simply stared at him, and Ethan could not read the emotions crossing her face. Surprise, disbelief, something that looked almost like pain. Finally, she stepped back from the door, holding it open. "You'd better come in, then," she said quietly. "It's cold out there." Her apartment was small but neat, sparsely furnished, the kind of place that belonged to someone who had learned to live without much and had made peace with it. There were no family photographs on the walls, Ethan noticed, no framed pictures of holidays or gatherings. Just a few books stacked on a shelf, a worn couch, and a small kitchen table with 2 mismatched chairs. "I don't have much to offer you," Mia said, gesturing toward the couch. "Just tea if you want it." "Tea would be nice," Ethan said, sitting down carefully, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a space that held so much of a person's quiet, private life. While she made the tea, Ethan looked around the small apartment, trying to piece together the puzzle of who Mia Bennett was. There was a small desk in the corner with a laptop and neat stacks of paper, suggesting she worked hard, perhaps too hard. A single potted plant sat on the windowsill, slightly wilted, as though it had been forgotten in the middle of a busy week. Mia returned with 2 cups of tea and sat across from him in the other mismatched chair. "So," she said, "tell me about this promise." Ethan told her the story of that night on his porch years ago, when Leo had spoken of her with such quiet seriousness. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, and he saw something soften in her eyes, some old defense slowly beginning to lower. "He never told me he said that," Mia said softly when Ethan finished. "He never told me much of anything, actually, not because he didn't care. I think he did, in his own way, but our family made it very difficult for him to be close to me. They didn't approve." She wrapped both hands around her teacup, staring down into it as if the answers to old questions might be found in the steam rising from the surface. "What happened?" Ethan asked gently, "if you don't mind me asking." Mia was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan wondered if he had pushed too far too soon. But then she began to speak, slowly, carefully, as if each word had to be chosen with great effort. "My father had an affair," she said. "With my mother. I was the result of it. When his wife found out, the whole family turned against my mother and against me, even though I was just a baby and had nothing to do with any of it. My father tried for a while to be part of my life, but it caused too much trouble, too much shame for the family name. Eventually, he stopped trying. My mother raised me alone and she passed away when I was 19. Since then, I've mostly been on my own. And Leo? Ethan asked. A small, sad smile touched Mia's lips. Leo was the only one who ever tried, really tried, to know me. We'd meet sometimes, quietly, away from the rest of the family. He'd call me on my birthday. He helped me move into this apartment 2 years ago. He wasn't perfect about it. He was scared of what the family would think if they found out how close we were becoming, but he cared. He was the only piece of that family who ever made me feel like I belonged to something. Ethan felt a heavy sadness settle in his chest, thinking of his friend, a man who had always seemed so open and warm to everyone around him, quietly carrying the guilt and complication of a sister he loved, but could not fully claim. And now he's gone, Mia said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time since Ethan had met her. And I have nothing left. No family. No one who even remembers I exist except maybe you, and only because of a promise made on a porch years ago. That's not nothing, Ethan said quietly. I remembered I'm here. Mia looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. There was something fragile in the air between them, something new and uncertain, built on grief and honesty, and the strange, unexpected kindness of a stranger who had chosen to keep a promise that no one would have blamed him for forgetting. You don't owe me anything, Mia said finally, breaking the silence. You made a promise to a friend who's gone now. You don't have to keep visiting me out of guilt or obligation. I've survived on my own for a long time. I'll keep surviving. I'm not here out of guilt, Ethan said, surprising himself with how certain his voice sounded. I'm here because I want to be, because it isn't right what happened to you, being pushed aside, forgotten, blamed for something you never chose. Leo saw that unfairness too, even if he wasn't always brave enough to fix it. Maybe I can't fix it either, but I can at least make sure you're not alone. Mia studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as though trying to detect some hidden motive, some flaw in his kindness that would eventually reveal itself. But she found none, and slowly, cautiously, something like trust began to form in the space where suspicion had been. All right, she said quietly. Friends then, if that's what you want. Friends, Ethan agreed, and something about the simple word felt like the beginning of something much larger than either of them yet understood. Over the following weeks, Ethan made good on his word. He began visiting Mia regularly, sometimes bringing groceries when he noticed her fridge was nearly empty, sometimes simply sitting with her in comfortable silence while she worked at her small desk. He learned that she worked long hours at a local accounting firm, quiet, careful work that suited her methodical mind, but that left her exhausted and isolated, with little time or energy for a social life. He learned that she loved old films, the kind with black and white photography and slow, thoughtful stories. He learned that she was sharper and funnier than she let most people see, with a dry, quick wit that emerged only once she felt safe enough to lower her guard. He learned that she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned family gatherings or holidays, old wounds that had never properly healed. And slowly, without quite realizing it was happening, Ethan found himself looking forward to these visits more than he looked forward to almost anything else in his life. He told himself it was simply friendship, simply loyalty to Leo's memory. But some quiet part of him had already begun to suspect that something more was growing in the space between them, something neither of them was yet ready to name. Mia, for her part, began to change too, though slowly, cautiously. She smiled more often when Ethan visited. She began to volunteer small pieces of her past, memories of her mother, stories of her difficult childhood, things she had never shared with anyone before. It was as though, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who was not simply tolerating her presence, but genuinely wanted to know her. But even as their friendship deepened, the shadow of Leo's family loomed over them both. Word had begun to spread, quietly at first, through relatives and family friends, that Ethan Miller, Leo's closest friend, had been spending an unusual amount of time with the family's forgotten daughter. and not everyone in the family was pleased by the news. One evening, as Ethan sat with Mia in her small apartment, sharing a simple dinner she had insisted on cooking as thanks for his kindness, his phone rang. It was Leo's aunt, Grace Bennett, a woman known throughout the family for her strong opinions and her tight control over family matters. "Ethan," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, "I hear you've been spending quite a lot of time with Mia." "I have," Ethan said carefully, sensing the tension building on the other end of the line. "I think you should be careful," Grace said. "That girl brings nothing but complication. She always has. I'd hate to see you get pulled into something you don't understand." Ethan felt a flash of anger rise in his chest, sharp and immediate, on Mia's behalf. "With respect, Grace," he said, keeping his voice steady, "I think Mia deserves better than being called a complication by her own family." There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. "You don't know the whole story," Grace said finally, her voice tightening further. "Then maybe someone should tell it to me properly," Ethan replied. "Instead of hiding a woman away at her own brother's funeral like she doesn't have the right to grieve too." Grace ended the call without another word, and Ethan sat for a long moment, staring at his phone, his heart still pounding with the aftereffects of the confrontation. When he looked up, Mia was watching him from across the table, her expression unreadable. "That was Grace, wasn't it?" she said quietly. It was not a question. Ethan nodded. "They don't like this," Mia said. "You spending time with me. It threatens the story they've told themselves for years, the one where I'm the problem, the shameful secret, the mistake that should have been forgotten." She looked down at her plate, her voice growing smaller. "You should listen to them, Ethan. I don't want to be the reason you lose your place in Leo's family." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture that surprised them both. "Leo's family doesn't get to decide who I care about. And neither do you, apparently, if you think I'm going to walk away that easily." Mia looked down at his hand covering hers, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan saw the faint, unguarded beginnings of a real smile cross her face, one that reached all the way to her tired, careful eyes. "Stubborn," she said softly. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" "Probably," Ethan said, smiling back. "Get used to it." Outside, the evening had settled into full darkness, and somewhere across town, in a large, comfortable house full of old family photographs and careful, curated memories, Grace Bennett sat by her phone, already planning how she would explain this unwelcome development to the rest of the family. She did not yet know how far it would go, how deeply this unlikely friendship would grow, or how powerless her opinions would eventually become against it. All she knew, staring into the darkened window of her living room, was that trouble had found its way back into the family, wearing a familiar, unwelcome face. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping the town in an unusually cold, sharp frost that settled over rooftops and empty streets. Ethan had not planned to fall into a rhythm of daily visits to Mia's small apartment, but somehow that was exactly what had happened. Without either of them fully naming what was growing between them, they had become fixtures in each other's ordinary lives, sharing dinners, quiet conversations, and the slow, careful work of building trust between two people who had both learned, in their own ways, to expect very little from the world. It was on one of those cold evenings, as Ethan helped Mia carry a stack of heavy boxes up the narrow stairwell to her apartment, that he first learned the full weight of what she had endured. She had decided to finally sort through old belongings that had once belonged to her mother, boxes she had kept sealed for years, unable to face them. "I haven't opened these since she passed," Mia admitted, setting the last box down on her small living room floor. "I always told myself I'd do it when I was ready. I don't think I've ever been ready." "You don't have to do it tonight," Ethan said gently, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "No," Mia said, taking a slow breath. "I think I do. I think I've been avoiding it long enough." She knelt down beside the first box, running her fingers over the worn cardboard edges, and Ethan settled onto the floor beside her, offering silent support rather than pushing her forward. Inside the box were old photographs, faded and curling at the corners, of a woman with Mia's same sharp eyes and quiet, careful smile. There were letters, tied together with a thin ribbon, and a small collection of jewelry, simple pieces that had clearly been treasured despite their modest value. "This was her wedding ring," Mia said softly, lifting a delicate silver band from a small velvet box. "Not from my father, obviously, from before. She was married once briefly before everything with my father happened. It didn't work out. I think that's part of why the family judged her so harshly later. They already saw her as someone who couldn't hold a family together." Ethan listened quietly as Mia continued to sort through the box, sharing pieces of her mother's story. Fragments of a difficult life that Mia had clearly pieced together slowly over the years, gathered from overheard conversations and half-answered questions. "She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood," Mia continued. "Cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during the day. She never complained, not once, not even when things were hardest. She used to tell me that the 2 of us didn't need anyone else, that we had each other, and that was enough." Mia's voice grew quieter. "I believed her for a long time. It was easier to believe that than to admit how much it hurt, being cut off from an entire side of my family simply because of choices I never made." "She sounds like she was strong," Ethan said. "She was," Mia agreed. "Stronger than I probably give her credit for. I used to be angry at her when I was younger. Angry that she'd fallen in love with a married man, angry that her choices had cost me any chance of a normal family. It took me years to understand that she never chose any of this either. She simply loved someone who wasn't free to love her back properly, and I was the result of that mistake, forced to carry consequences that were never mine to carry." Ethan reached over and gently took her hand, the same gesture he had offered weeks earlier during the phone call with Grace, and this time Mia did not hesitate before accepting the comfort it offered. "You're not a mistake," he said firmly. "You never were. Whatever choices your parents made, you are not the sum of their errors. You're your own person, Mia, and from everything I've seen, you're a remarkable one." Mia looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and for a long moment the air between them grew thick with something unspoken, something neither of them had yet found the courage to name aloud. "You keep saying things like that," she said softly, "things nobody else has ever bothered to say to me." "Maybe nobody else was paying close enough attention," Ethan said. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, sorting through the remaining contents of the box, until Mia finally closed it, setting it carefully aside with the others, as though placing a difficult chapter of her life gently to rest. "Thank you," she said, "for staying while I did that. I don't think I could have gotten through it alone." "You don't have to do hard things alone anymore," Ethan said. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Over the following weeks, their bond continued to deepen in quiet, ordinary ways. Ethan began noticing small changes in himself, the way his thoughts drifted to Mia throughout his workday, the way he found himself smiling at memories of her dry humor, the particular warmth he felt whenever she laughed, a rare and precious sound that had grown less rare the more time they spent together. He tried, for a while, to convince himself that these feelings were simply the natural result of a deep friendship, nothing more. But one evening, as he sat across from her at a small local restaurant, she had reluctantly agreed to try. Watching her laugh freely at something he had said, he understood with sudden and undeniable clarity that his feelings for her had grown into something far larger than friendship. He said nothing that night, unsure how she would respond, unwilling to risk the fragile trust they had built together. But the realization stayed with him, quiet and persistent, growing harder to ignore with each passing day. Mia, though she did not speak of it either, was experiencing a similar shift within herself. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, looking forward to each new day, not because of any change in her difficult circumstances, but because of the steady, comforting presence of a man who had chosen, again and again, to show up for her without asking for anything in return. But their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed by the wider Bennett family, and tensions that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface soon began to boil over into open conflict. It happened at a small gathering, a memorial dinner held several months after Leo's passing, meant to bring the family together in remembrance of him. Ethan had been invited, as one of Leo's closest friends, and on impulse, feeling that Mia deserved the chance to grieve her brother alongside the rest of the family, he had invited her to attend as well. The evening began tensely, with careful, forced politeness among relatives who clearly did not approve of Mia's presence, but were unwilling to cause a scene in front of the wider group. Mia herself seemed nervous but determined, dressed carefully, her posture straight, as though bracing herself for an unpleasant confrontation she knew was likely coming. It came during dinner, when Grace, seated at the head of the table, raised her glass for a toast in Leo's memory. Her words were warm and heartfelt, praising her nephew's kindness, his generosity, his deep love for his family. But as she continued speaking, her eyes flicked pointedly toward Mia, and her tone shifted, growing sharper. "Leo believed in loyalty," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly across the table. "In protecting the family, in honoring the people who truly belong to it. I think it's important we remember that tonight, of all nights." The implication was unmistakable, and Ethan felt Mia stiffen beside him, her hand tightening briefly around her napkin before releasing it, her expression carefully composed despite the clear hurt in her eyes. "With respect, Grace," Ethan said, unable to stay silent, "Leo believed in loyalty to Mia too. He asked me personally to look out for her. I think honoring his memory means honoring that request, not ignoring it." A tense silence fell over the table. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, unwilling to openly take sides, but clearly uneasy with the confrontation unfolding before them. "This isn't the time or place, Ethan," Grace said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "Then perhaps it's overdue," Ethan replied evenly. "Because I don't understand how a family can gather to remember a man's kindness and generosity while treating his own sister as an unwelcome guest at the table." Mia placed a gentle hand on Ethan's arm, quietly signaling him to stop, and he fell silent, though the tension in the room remained thick and uncomfortable. Dinner continued in strained, careful conversation, and shortly afterward, Mia excused herself early, thanking the hosts politely despite the clear hurt still lingering in her expression. Ethan followed her outside, finding her standing alone near her car, wrapping her coat tightly around herself against the cold night air. "I shouldn't have come," she said quietly before he could speak. "I knew it would be like this. I don't know why I thought tonight would be any different." "You had every right to be there," Ethan said. "Leo was your brother too. You deserved a chance to grieve him with the rest of his family." "Maybe," Mia said, her voice tired. "But it's clear they'll never see it that way. I appreciate what you did in there standing up for me, but it doesn't change anything. It never has." "It changes something for me," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Watching you tonight, watching how much you deserve better than the way they treat you, it made something very clear to me." Mia looked up at him, her breath visible in the cold night air, her eyes searching his face with cautious hope and equally cautious fear. "What's that?" she asked softly. "That I don't just care about you because of a promise I made to Leo anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the moment. "I care about you because of who you are, because you're kind and strong and funnier than you let most people see. Because being with you, even during hard moments like tonight, feels more real than most of the rest of my life." Mia's eyes glistened in the moonlight, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of his words settling into the quiet space between them. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to say things like that just to make me feel better tonight." "I'm not," he said. "I mean every word." Slowly, hesitantly, as though testing whether the moment was truly real, Mia reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers cold from the winter air but her touch impossibly gentle. Ethan covered her hand with his own, leaning into the touch, and for the first time since they had met, months of careful friendship gave way to something entirely new, entirely undeniable. Neither of them spoke of it further that night, both too overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the ground beneath them to fully process what it meant. Ethan simply walked her to her car, promised to call her the next day, and watched her drive away into the cold darkness, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope he had not felt in years. Inside the house behind him, the memorial dinner continued without them. The family gathered together in careful, curated remembrance of a man who had loved his sister quietly and imperfectly, never quite brave enough to bridge the gap the rest of his family had built between them. Grace watched Ethan through the window as he drove away, her expression unreadable, already beginning to calculate how she might address this unwelcome development before it grew any further beyond her control. She did not yet understand that it was already far too late for that. The bond between Ethan and Mia had passed beyond the reach of family disapproval, rooted now in something far stronger than the old prejudices and careful family narratives that had shaped Mia's entire life. It was rooted in genuine understanding, genuine respect, and the quiet, powerful beginnings of a love neither of them had expected to find, but which neither of them now had any intention of letting go. News in the Bennett family traveled fast, and by the following week, it seemed every relative had heard some version of what had happened at the memorial dinner. Some versions were close to the truth. Others had grown wild in the retelling, exaggerated by gossip and old resentments until they barely resembled what had actually taken place. Ethan found himself the subject of hushed conversations at family gatherings he was no longer invited to, and Mia, already accustomed to being talked about rather than talked to, bore the brunt of the family's disapproval with a weary resignation that broke Ethan's heart every time he witnessed it. "They think I trapped you somehow," Mia said one evening, curled up on her small couch with a cup of tea, her voice carrying a tired, bitter edge. "That I saw an opportunity after Leo died and took advantage of your kindness. As if I have some hidden agenda beyond simply wanting someone in my life who actually cares about me." "Nobody who matters believes that," Ethan said firmly, sitting beside her. "It doesn't matter whether it's true," Mia said. "It matters that they believe it, or want to believe it, because it's easier than admitting they were wrong about me all along." Ethan understood the truth in her words, even as it frustrated him deeply. He had grown up with a relatively stable, loving family himself, and watching Mia navigate a lifetime of rejection from people who should have loved her unconditionally filled him with a quiet, simmering anger he had rarely felt before. Determined to address the situation directly, Ethan arranged a meeting with Leo's parents, hoping that, as the people who had raised Leo, they might carry more influence over the family's opinions than Grace or the other relatives. The meeting took place at their home, in a comfortable living room filled with framed photographs of Leo at various ages, smiling in each one with the same warm, easy confidence that had made him so beloved by everyone who knew him. Ethan noticed, with a familiar pang of sadness, that there were no photographs of Mia anywhere in the room, despite her being Leo's sister. "Ethan," Leo's mother said, offering him tea with trembling hands that had not fully steadied since her son's death. "It's good to see you. We've missed having you around." "I've missed being around," Ethan admitted, "though I imagine you've heard about the tension at the memorial dinner." Leo's father, a quiet, reserved man who had said little throughout the difficult month since his son's passing, set down his cup carefully. "We heard," he said. "Grace has been quite vocal about her concerns." "I understand the family has a complicated history with Mia," Ethan said carefully, choosing his words with care. "But I have to ask you both honestly, do either of you believe she deserves to be treated the way she has been, excluded, ignored, blamed for circumstances she never chose?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Leo's mother looked down at her hands, and for a long moment neither parent spoke. "It's complicated," Leo's father said finally, his voice low. "Her existence was difficult for this family, for reasons I won't go into. But you're right that punishing her for choices that weren't hers has never sat well with me. I think, if I'm honest, it never sat well with Leo either." "He asked me to look out for her," Ethan said quietly. "Before he died, he told me nobody else would." Leo's mother's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of her son's words being shared with her for the first time. "He never told me that," she whispered. "I don't think he felt he could," Ethan said gently. "I think the family's disapproval made it very difficult for him to be as close to Mia as he wanted to be. I think that regret weighed on him more than any of us realized." The room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence, broken only by the quiet sound of Leo's mother's tears. Finally, she looked up at Ethan, her expression carrying a mixture of grief and dawning understanding. "What do you want from us, Ethan?" she asked softly. "I don't want anything from you," Ethan said honestly. "I just think Mia deserves the chance to be part of this family, in whatever way she's comfortable with, without being treated as an unwelcome outsider. I think that's what Leo would have wanted, even if he never found the courage to say it clearly himself." Leo's father was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his folded hands. "Grace has always been the loudest voice in matters like this," he said finally. "But she doesn't speak for all of us. Give us time, Ethan. This won't change overnight, but we'll try." It was not the full acceptance Ethan had hoped for, but it was more than he had expected, and he left the meeting with a cautious, fragile sense of hope that had been largely absent from the family's response until now. He shared the details of the conversation with Mia that evening, watching carefully for her reaction. She listened quietly, her expression difficult to read, and when he finished, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I appreciate what you tried to do," she said finally. "I really do, but Ethan, I need you to understand something. I've spent my entire life hoping this family would finally accept me, finally see me as someone who belongs. Every single time I've allowed myself to hope, I've been disappointed. I don't know if I can survive being disappointed again." "I understand," Ethan said, "but I don't think hope is a bad thing even when it's frightening." "It's easy for you to say that," Mia said, not unkindly, but with a weary honesty that cut through the room. "You've never had to build your entire sense of self around the possibility that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally might never fully accept you. I have. And I'm tired, Ethan. I'm tired of hoping and being disappointed." Ethan reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, though her expression remained guarded. "You don't have to hope for their acceptance," he said gently. "You already have mine, completely without condition. Whatever happens with the rest of the family, that isn't going to change." Mia's eyes searched his face for a long moment, as if trying to detect any trace of insincerity in his words. Finding none, something in her posture finally relaxed, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder with a quiet, exhausted trust that told him more clearly than words how much his steady presence had come to mean to her. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of the day slowly easing between them, until Mia finally spoke again, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Ethan," she said, "can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course," he said. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked. "The meetings with Leo's parents, standing up to Grace, spending nearly every evening here with me. I know you said it started as a promise to Leo, but it's grown into so much more than that now. I need to understand why." Ethan considered his answer carefully, aware of the significance of the moment. "Because somewhere along the way," he said slowly, "keeping my promise to Leo stopped being about him and started being about you. I care about you, Mia. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because of who you are and because being with you has become one of the best parts of my life." Mia lifted her head from his shoulder, studying his face with an intensity that made his heart race. "I care about you too," she admitted quietly, as though the words cost her something significant to say aloud. "More than I expected to, more than I think I know how to handle honestly." "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Ethan said gently. "We can take it slowly if that feels safer." "I don't want to take it slowly," Mia said, surprising them both with the sudden certainty in her voice. "I've spent my whole life being careful, being cautious, protecting myself from people who were never going to hurt me the way I feared they would. I don't want to do that with you." Ethan felt something warm and hopeful bloom in his chest, and without another word, he leaned forward and gently pressed his lips to hers. A soft, careful kiss that felt like the culmination of months of quiet devotion finally finding its natural expression. Mia kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek, and in that moment, months of grief, uncertainty, and careful friendship gave way to something entirely new, entirely theirs. When they finally pulled apart, Mia rested her forehead gently against his, a small, genuine smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose that answers a few questions." Ethan laughed quietly, his heart still racing. "I suppose it does." Outside, the winter night continued undisturbed, unaware of the quiet, significant shift that had just taken place within the small apartment. Somewhere across town, Grace Bennett continued to plan her careful campaign of family disapproval, unaware that the bond between Ethan and Mia had already grown far beyond anything her opinions could hope to unravel. And somewhere in a place beyond the reach of either of them, Leo Bennett's memory watched over the two people he had loved most in his final years, a friend and a sister who had, against every obstacle placed before them, finally found their way to each other, exactly as he had once hoped, without ever having the courage to see it fully realized while he was still alive. Spring arrived slowly that year, melting away the hard frost of winter and softening the edges of a season that had brought both grief and unexpected love into Ethan's life. As the weather warmed, so too did the rhythm of his relationship with Mia, settling into something steady and comfortable, built on months of honesty and quiet devotion. But even as their bond deepened, both of them understood that the challenges facing them were far from over. It began with a phone call from Leo's mother, her voice hesitant but hopeful, inviting both Ethan and Mia to a family gathering. A simple spring dinner meant to celebrate the season, and though she did not say it outright, to test whether the family might finally be ready to extend a genuine welcome to Mia after months of careful, private conversations Leo's parents had been having with other relatives. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Mia admitted, standing in front of her closet, staring at her limited selection of clothing with visible anxiety. "What if it's just another version of the memorial dinner? What if I get my hopes up again, only to be disappointed?" "Then we leave," Ethan said simply, standing behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Together." No hesitation, but I don't think that's going to happen this time. I think Leo's parents have been working hard behind the scenes to prepare the family. Mia turned to face him, her expression torn between hope and fear. "And if Grace is there, if she says something cruel in front of everyone again?" "Then I'll stand beside you exactly like I did last time," Ethan said firmly. "You're not walking into that house alone, Mia. Not now, not ever." Reassured, though still visibly nervous, Mia finally selected a simple blue dress, and together they made their way to the Bennett family home, a modest but comfortable house filled with the warm smell of home-cooked food and the low hum of family conversation drifting from the open windows. When they arrived, the tension in the air was immediately noticeable, though it carried a different quality than before, less openly hostile, more uncertain, as though the family itself was unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar territory. Leo's mother greeted them warmly at the door, embracing Mia with a hug that lingered slightly longer than politeness required, as though trying to convey years of unspoken apology in a single gesture. "I'm so glad you came," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "Both of you." Inside, the gathering unfolded with a cautious, careful energy. Several relatives greeted Mia with polite, if reserved, conversation, clearly still uncertain how to interact with a woman they had spent years actively avoiding. But there was no open hostility, no pointed remarks, and slowly, as the evening progressed, Mia's rigid posture began to relax, replaced by the same quiet, careful hope that Ethan had grown to recognize in her over the past several months. It was during dinner that Leo's father rose from his seat, tapping his glass gently to draw the table's attention. The room quieted, and Ethan felt Mia stiffen slightly beside him, bracing herself for whatever was about to be said. "I want to say something," Leo's father began, his voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. For a long time, this family made choices about how to treat Mia that I'm not proud of. Choices that hurt her deeply, for reasons that were never her fault. I won't pretend to fully understand or excuse those choices. But I want to say clearly in front of everyone here that Mia is Leo's sister. She always has been. And she is welcome in this family, fully and without condition, for as long as she wants to be part of it. A heavy silence settled over the table, broken only by the soft sound of Mia's sharp intake of breath beside him. Ethan reached for her hand under the table, offering silent support as tears welled in her eyes, tears that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of longing finally, unexpectedly, being acknowledged. Not everyone at the table appeared entirely comfortable with the declaration. Grace, seated near the far end of the table, remained conspicuously silent, her expression tight and unreadable. But several other relatives offered quiet nods of agreement, and a few even raised their glasses in a small, tentative toast, acknowledging, however imperfectly, the wrong that had finally been named aloud. After dinner, as the gathering began to wind down, Mia excused herself to step outside onto the back porch, needing a moment alone to process the overwhelming events of the evening. Ethan gave her space, watching from a distance as she stood staring out at the darkening garden, her shoulders trembling slightly with quiet, cathartic tears. It was Grace who approached her first, stepping out onto the porch with a stiff, uncertain posture that Ethan had never seen from her before. He moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but something in Grace's expression made him hesitate, curious to see how the moment would unfold. "Mia," Grace said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge, "I owe you an apology." Mia turned, visibly startled, wiping quickly at her tear-streaked face. "You don't have to say that," she said cautiously, "not if you don't mean it." "I do mean it," Grace said, and for the first time her carefully controlled composure seemed to waver. "I was young when your father's affair came to light. I watched what it did to this family, to my sister, Leo's mother. I built a narrative in my mind that made it easier to bear, one where you were the symbol of everything that had gone wrong, rather than an innocent child who had no say in any of it. It was easier to blame you than to sit with the complicated truth of what actually happened. That wasn't fair to you. It never was." Mia stood silently for a long moment, processing the unexpected admission. "That's a lot of years of blame to carry on both sides," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "It is," Grace agreed. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight or even soon. I only wanted you to know that I see now how wrong I was. Leo tried to tell me more than once and I never listened. I regret that more than I can say, especially now that he's gone and can no longer tell me himself." A single tear slipped down Mia's cheek, and this time she did not bother to wipe it away. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saying that. It means more than you probably realize." Grace nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional weight of the conversation, and after a moment she turned and made her way back inside, leaving Mia alone on the porch once more. Ethan approached quietly, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, and she leaned back into his embrace, her body finally relaxing after months, years, of carrying the weight of rejection. "I can't quite believe that just happened," she whispered. "Believe it," Ethan said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You deserve this, Mia. All of it." They stood together on the porch for a long while, watching the stars slowly emerge in the darkening sky, both of them quietly aware that something significant had shifted that evening, not only in the family's acceptance of Mia, but in the depth and permanence of the bond growing between the two of them. In the weeks that followed, the changes within the family, though gradual and imperfect, continued steadily. Mia was invited to smaller family gatherings, tentative at first, then with growing regularity. Leo's mother began calling her more frequently, sharing stories and memories of Leo that Mia had never had the chance to hear, slowly filling in the gaps of a childhood spent largely on the outside of her brother's life. Even Grace, though still reserved, began offering small, careful gestures of inclusion, invitations to coffee, brief but genuine conversations that, while far from close, represented a meaningful shift from the cold dismissal of the past. Through it all, Ethan remained a steady, constant presence beside Mia, celebrating each small victory with her, offering comfort during the moments when old wounds still ached despite the family's slowly changing attitude. Their relationship, forged initially through grief and a promise made to a departed friend, had grown into something far deeper and more enduring than either of them could have anticipated in those early, uncertain days following Leo's funeral. One warm evening in early summer, as they sat together on a park bench overlooking a quiet lake, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink across the water, Mia turned to Ethan with a thoughtful, contemplative expression. "Do you ever think about how strange this all is?" she asked. "That I only met you because of Leo's death, that the worst day of my life somehow led to the best thing that's ever happened to me." Ethan considered her words carefully before responding. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the hardest, most painful moments in our lives end up leading us exactly where we're meant to be, even if we can't see it at the time. Losing Leo was devastating. It still is, in a lot of ways. But if his death is what led me to you, then I have to believe there's some meaning in that, even amid all the grief." Mia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last colors of sunset fade slowly into the soft blue of early evening. "I think I believe that too," she said quietly. "I think somehow Leo would be happy about this, about us." "I think he would be too," Ethan agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her closer. "I think, in his own quiet way, this is exactly what he was hoping for, even before either of us understood what it meant." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead, two people bound together by grief, by an unlikely promise, and by a love that had grown slowly, steadily, into something neither of them could imagine living without. But even as their bond continued to deepen, and the family's acceptance of Mia continued to grow, there remained one significant hurdle neither of them had yet fully faced, a hurdle that would test the strength of their relationship far more severely than any family disapproval ever had. It arrived not through the words of a disapproving relative, but through a diagnosis that would change the course of their lives entirely, forcing both of them to confront just how deeply committed they truly were to each other, and to the fragile, precious love they had built together against every expectation. It started with small things, easy to dismiss. Mia grew tired more quickly than usual, needing to rest after simple tasks that had never troubled her before. She developed a persistent ache in her side that she initially attributed to long hours hunched over her desk at work. Ethan noticed the changes before she was willing to acknowledge them herself, watching with growing concern as the woman who had always carried herself with quiet, determined strength began to move more carefully, more slowly, as though something invisible was steadily draining her energy. "You should see a doctor," he said one evening, watching her wince as she shifted position on the couch. "It's probably nothing," Mia said, waving off his concern with the same stubborn independence that had defined much of her life. "I've been under a lot of stress. It's likely just exhaustion." But as the weeks passed and her symptoms worsened rather than improved, Ethan's concern grew too strong to ignore, and he finally convinced her, with gentle but persistent encouragement, to schedule an appointment with her doctor. The days leading up to the appointment passed with an undercurrent of quiet anxiety that neither of them spoke aloud. Ethan accompanied her to the clinic, sitting beside her in the small waiting room, holding her hand as they waited for her name to be called, both of them trying to appear calmer than they felt. The examination itself took longer than expected, and Ethan watched the clock in the waiting room with growing unease as the minutes stretched into an hour. When Mia finally emerged, her expression was carefully controlled, but Ethan could see the fear lingering beneath her calm exterior. "They want to run some additional tests," she said quietly as they walked back to the car. "The doctor found something during the examination. She didn't want to speculate too much until the results come back, but she seemed concerned." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest, but he kept his voice steady, focused on offering the same calm reassurance Mia had given him during countless difficult moments over the past year. "Whatever it is," he said, "we'll face it together. You're not going through this alone." The following 2 weeks passed in an agonizing blur of uncertainty, as they waited for the results of the additional tests. Ethan tried to maintain a normal routine, continuing to work and visit Mia each evening, but the tension of waiting hung heavily over every interaction, a silent, unspoken fear neither of them wanted to name aloud until they had more information. Finally, the day of the follow-up appointment arrived. Ethan sat beside Mia once again in the small examination room, his hand firmly clasped around hers, as the doctor entered with a folder of test results and an expression that immediately confirmed their worst fears. "I'm sorry to tell you this," the doctor said gently, "but the tests have confirmed a growth that requires immediate attention. It's still in a relatively early stage, which is good news, but we'll need to begin treatment as soon as possible to give you the best possible outcome." The room seemed to spin slightly as Ethan absorbed the weight of the diagnosis, his mind racing through 1,000 fears and questions at once. Beside him, Mia sat rigidly still, her face pale, her hand gripping his with white-knuckled intensity. "What does treatment look like?" Mia asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the visible fear in her eyes. The doctor outlined a treatment plan involving surgery followed by an extended period of recovery and additional therapy, explaining the process carefully and answering their questions with patient, measured honesty. It was a frightening path ahead, filled with uncertainty and difficult months to come, but the doctor's tone carried a note of genuine hope, emphasizing the relatively early stage of the diagnosis and the strong likelihood of a positive outcome with proper treatment. Still, walking out of the clinic that afternoon, both Ethan and Mia felt the world had shifted beneath them, the comfortable rhythm of their newfound happiness suddenly overshadowed by a frightening uncertainty neither of them had anticipated. That evening, sitting together in Mia's small apartment, the weight of the day's news finally broke through the composed exterior she had maintained throughout the appointment. She sat curled on the couch, tears streaming silently down her face, her earlier strength giving way to raw, unguarded fear. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life being alone, being strong because I had no other choice. I don't know how to be scared like this in front of someone else. I don't know how to let you see me like this." Ethan knelt in front of her, taking both of her hands in his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't have to be strong for me, Mia," he said softly. "Not now, not ever. Let me be strong for both of us for as long as you need me to be. I'm not going anywhere. Not through surgery, not through recovery, not through any of it." "You don't have to stay," Mia said, her voice breaking. "This isn't what you signed up for. You didn't ask for this kind of burden." "Stop," Ethan said firmly, gently but insistently. "I need you to understand something clearly right now because I think it's important you hear it. I didn't fall in love with you despite the difficulty of your life, Mia. I fell in love with you because of your strength, your resilience, the way you've faced every hardship life has thrown at you with quiet, determined courage. This is just one more hardship. And I intend to face it beside you, exactly as I've faced everything else since the day I met you." Mia searched his face for a long moment, as if trying to fully absorb the certainty in his words, before finally breaking down entirely, sobbing openly against his shoulder as he held her close, offering silent, steady comfort in the face of an uncertain and frightening future. In the weeks that followed, Ethan proved the sincerity of his words through countless small, steady acts of devotion. He accompanied her to every medical appointment, took time off work to be present during her surgery, and remained by her bedside throughout the difficult early days of her recovery, when pain and exhaustion made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. He learned to manage her medications, to prepare the specific, gentle foods her recovering body could tolerate, to recognize the subtle signs of her exhaustion before she was willing to admit it herself. He sat with her through long, difficult nights when fear and uncertainty made sleep impossible, offering quiet reassurance and steady, unwavering presence. Word of Mia's diagnosis reached the wider Bennett family, and to Ethan's quiet relief, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Leo's mother visited frequently, bringing homemade meals and offering the kind of maternal comfort Mia had been denied for most of her life. Even Grace, in her own reserved way, made an effort to check in regularly, sending thoughtful messages and, on one memorable occasion, sitting quietly beside Mia's hospital bed for nearly an hour, offering simple, steady companionship without the need for extensive conversation. "I think Leo would be proud of how the family has responded," Mia said one afternoon, several weeks into her recovery, as she and Ethan sat together in her sunlit living room. "I never expected this kind of support, especially not from Grace." "People can change," Ethan said, "especially when they're given the chance to see things clearly without the old narratives clouding their judgment." Mia nodded thoughtfully, then reached for his hand, her expression growing more serious. "Ethan," she said, "I need to say something to you, and I need you to really hear it." "Of course," he said, giving her his full attention. "These past few months have been the hardest of my life," Mia said slowly, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "But they've also shown me something I don't think I ever truly understood before. I've spent my entire life believing that love was conditional, that people only stayed as long as things were easy, as long as I didn't become too much of a burden. You've shown me, again and again, through every difficult day, that isn't true. Not with you." Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to her words, understanding the significance of what she was expressing, the deep, hard-won trust she was placing in him after a lifetime of learning not to trust anyone fully. "I meant every word I said to you that night," he said softly. "I love you, Mia, not despite the hard parts of your life, but because of the strength and resilience those hard parts have shaped in you. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face, I intend to face them beside you, for as long as you'll have me." Mia's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time, they carried none of the fear or uncertainty of the difficult weeks before. Instead, they shone with a quiet, hopeful joy that Ethan had rarely seen in her before, the look of a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of disappointment, allowed herself to fully believe in the possibility of unconditional love. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than I ever thought I'd allow myself to love anyone." As the months passed, Mia's recovery progressed steadily, her strength returning gradually, her color and energy improving with each passing week. The difficult chapter of her diagnosis, though it had tested their relationship in ways neither of them had anticipated, had ultimately strengthened the bond between them, forging a depth of trust and commitment that would carry them steadily toward the next significant chapter of their lives together. By the time autumn arrived once more, a full year after Leo's death had first brought them together, Mia had made a full recovery, her doctors expressing confidence in her continued health with regular follow-up care. And as the golden leaves began to fall once more around the small park where they had first watched the sunset together months earlier, Ethan found himself preparing for a moment he had been anticipating for weeks, a moment that would mark the next, permanent chapter of the love they had built together against every obstacle life had placed in their path. The small park by the lake looked exactly as it had that summer evening, when Mia had first spoken of how strange it felt that Leo's death had somehow led her to the best thing that had ever happened to her life. Now, with autumn leaves drifting gently across the water and the late afternoon sun casting a warm golden light across the familiar bench, Ethan stood nervously beside the water's edge, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that felt entirely new, despite everything they had already faced together. He had planned this moment carefully, choosing the exact spot where their relationship had first deepened into something they both fully acknowledged, wanting the significance of the location to reflect the significance of what he was about to ask. In his pocket, he carried a small ring, simple and elegant, chosen with careful thought about Mia's practical, understated tastes. When Mia arrived, walking toward him along the familiar path with her characteristic quiet grace, fully recovered now from the difficult months of her illness, Ethan felt a fresh wave of gratitude wash over him, grateful beyond words that they had made it through that frightening chapter together, stronger for having faced it. "You seem nervous," Mia observed, studying his expression with the same sharp attentiveness that had first drawn him to her. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's more than all right," Ethan said, taking her hands in his as they stood together by the water's edge. "I wanted to bring you back here to this exact spot because I think this is where I first truly understood how deeply I loved you. Do you remember what you said to me that evening?" Mia's brow furrowed slightly, thinking back. "I said it felt strange that Leo's death had somehow led me to the best thing in my life." "That's right," Ethan said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "And I told you that I believed there was meaning in that even amid all the grief. I still believe that, Mia. More than ever now, after everything we've faced together this past year." He knelt down slowly on one knee, and Mia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with sudden understanding as tears began to gather at the corners of her eyes. "Bennett," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the intensity of the moment, "I never expected, walking into that cemetery over a year ago, that I would find the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. But that's exactly what happened. You've shown me through every difficult moment, every quiet act of courage, what it truly means to love someone unconditionally. I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that same unconditional love every single day. Will you marry me?" Mia stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment, tears streaming freely down her face. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice breaking with joyful emotion. "Yes, Ethan, of course, yes." Ethan rose to his feet, slipping the ring gently onto her trembling finger before pulling her into a tight, joyful embrace, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously as the weight of a year filled with grief, growth, and hard-won love finally gave way to pure, uncomplicated happiness. News of the engagement spread quickly through the Bennett family, and to Ethan's continued relief, the response was overwhelmingly warm and supportive. Leo's mother wept with joy upon hearing the news, embracing Mia with the same maternal warmth she had shown throughout the difficult months of her recovery. Even Grace, whose relationship with Mia had continued to slowly improve over the past months, offered a genuine, heartfelt congratulations, a far cry from the cold disapproval she had once directed toward the young woman she now seemed to have genuinely come to care for. Wedding planning began in earnest over the following months, and Mia found herself, for the first time in her life, surrounded by a growing circle of family and friends eager to help her celebrate this significant milestone. Leo's mother insisted on helping with the planning, taking Mia dress shopping, and offering gentle guidance drawn from years of family tradition that Mia had never before had the chance to experience firsthand. "I know this must feel overwhelming," Leo's mother said one afternoon, as they sat together sorting through wedding invitations, "having so much family involvement after spending so many years feeling excluded." "It does," Mia admitted honestly. "But it's a good kind of overwhelming. I never thought I'd have this sense of belonging to a family that actually wants me here." "You always belonged," Leo's mother said softly, reaching over to squeeze Mia's hand. "We simply failed for far too long to show you that clearly. I'm grateful, more than I can properly express, that we finally have the chance to make that right." As the wedding date approached, Ethan found himself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment. From the devastating grief of losing his closest friend, to a quiet promise made on a porch years earlier, to the unexpected, profound love that had grown from that promise into something far greater than either he or Mia could have anticipated. He visited Leo's grave the week before the wedding, standing alone in the quiet cemetery where he had first met Mia, the same cold grass beneath his feet, though the season now carried the golden warmth of early autumn rather than the ashen gray of that difficult winter morning over a year earlier. "I kept my promise," Ethan said quietly, addressing the simple headstone before him. "I looked out for her exactly like you asked me to, but it became so much more than that, Leo. I fell in love with her, completely, entirely, without any doubt or hesitation. I think somewhere you probably knew that would happen, even before either of us understood it ourselves." He stood in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind rustling gently through the trees surrounding the cemetery, before continuing. "I wish you could be there next week," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "I know it isn't fair that you had to leave us so soon, that you never got to see how deeply your sister deserved to be loved, how much she's grown into the incredible woman I've come to know over this past year. But I promise you, Leo, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure she never doubts that love again. I'm going to keep showing up for her, exactly like I promised you I would, for as long as I live." He placed a small bouquet of flowers gently against the headstone before turning to leave, feeling a quiet, peaceful sense of closure settle over him. A feeling that the promise made years earlier on a quiet porch had finally, fully, been honored in the way his friend had always hoped it would be. The wedding day arrived on a crisp, clear autumn morning, the trees surrounding the small, intimate venue Mia and Ethan had chosen ablaze with brilliant shades of orange, red, and gold. The ceremony was small, deliberately so, filled only with the people who had genuinely earned a place in Mia's life through years of quiet, steady loyalty, alongside the members of the Bennett family who had worked hard to make amends for years of painful exclusion. Mia walked down the simple garden aisle in a modest, elegant dress, her expression radiant with a joy that Ethan had watched grow steadily over the past year, from cautious, guarded hope to full, unguarded happiness. Leo's father, who had grown close to Mia over the preceding months, walked her down the aisle, a gesture that brought tears to nearly everyone in attendance, symbolizing the family's full, genuine acceptance of the woman they had once so carelessly excluded. As Ethan watched her approach, his heart full to overflowing with love and gratitude, he found himself thinking once more of that quiet porch conversation years earlier, of Leo's simple, serious request that had set this entire remarkable journey into motion. He had made a promise that night to look out for a sister he had never met. He had never imagined in his wildest expectations that keeping that promise would lead him to the deepest, most profound love of his entire life. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, filled with quiet, genuine emotion rather than elaborate spectacle. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, and Ethan leaned forward to kiss his new wife, the small gathering erupted into warm, joyful applause, celebrating not only the union of two people deeply in love, but the remarkable healing and reconciliation that had unfolded within an entire family over the course of a single, transformative year. As they danced together later that evening beneath strings of soft, glowing lights, surrounded by family and friends who had once been strangers or distant relatives, but had grown, through patience and grace, into a genuine and loving support system, Mia rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, a contented smile playing across her face. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "Any of it. Not the family accepting me, not finding someone who loves me the way you do. I spent so many years believing I'd always be alone, always be the forgotten piece of a family that never wanted me." "You're not forgotten anymore," Ethan said gently, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "You're loved, Mia, completely and without condition. Today and every day after this, for the rest of our lives." Mia looked up at him, her eyes shining with quiet, profound happiness, and in that moment, surrounded by the warm glow of celebration and the steady, unwavering love they had built together against every obstacle life had placed before them, both of them understood, with complete certainty, that whatever challenges the future might still hold, they would face them together, exactly as they had faced everything since the day fate had first brought them together in a quiet, gray cemetery over a year before. 5 years passed, each one adding new layers of depth and richness to the life Ethan and Mia had built together, a life neither of them could have fully imagined during those difficult early days following Leo's death. Their small apartment had long since given way to a modest, comfortable home on a quiet street, its walls now filled with the kind of family photographs Mia had once believed she would never have the chance to collect, images capturing birthdays, holidays, and countless ordinary, joyful moments spent surrounded by a family that had finally, fully embraced her. Leo's mother had become, over the years, something close to a second mother to Mia. their relationship deepening steadily through countless shared dinners, quiet conversations, and the gentle, patient healing of old wounds that had once seemed impossible to overcome. Grace, too, had continued her slow, genuine transformation, eventually becoming one of Mia's closest confidants within the family, their early tension replaced by a warm, if occasionally teasing, friendship built on mutual respect and hard-won understanding. Ethan had watched, with quiet pride and continued amazement, as Mia had grown increasingly confident in her place within the family and the world more broadly. The guarded, cautious woman he had first met standing alone behind a tree at her brother's funeral had grown into someone who laughed freely, who trusted deeply, who no longer flinched at the mention of family gatherings or holidays, but instead looked forward to them with genuine anticipation. Their life together was not without its ordinary challenges, the small disagreements and difficulties that accompany any long-term relationship. But through each of them, Ethan and Mia continued to demonstrate the same steady, unwavering commitment that had carried them through the far greater trials of their early years together. Whatever difficulty arose, they faced it as a team, communicating honestly, supporting each other fully, never allowing old fears or insecurities to undermine the deep trust they had worked so hard to build. It was on a warm summer evening, 5 years after their wedding, that Ethan found himself once again standing quietly at Leo's graveside, a visit that had become something of an annual tradition, a quiet moment of reflection and gratitude carried out each year around the anniversary of Leo's passing. This year, however, he was not alone. Beside him stood Mia, holding the small hand of their 4-year-old daughter, Lily, whose bright, curious eyes and quick, easy laughter carried unmistakable echoes of her uncle, a man she would never have the chance to meet, but whose memory had shaped her family's story in ways she was still too young to fully understand. "This is your Uncle Leo," Mia said gently, kneeling down beside her daughter, pointing toward the simple, well-maintained headstone before them. "He was my brother, and he loved your daddy very much, and in a way, he's the reason your daddy and I found each other." Lily studied the headstone with the innocent, uncomplicated curiosity of a young child, then looked up at her parents with a thoughtful expression. "Is he watching us?" she asked simply. Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion, exchanging a glance with Mia before answering gently. "I like to think he is," he said softly. "I think he'd be very proud of the family we've built." They stood together for a while longer, the summer breeze rustling gently through the trees surrounding the peaceful cemetery, before Lily grew restless, tugging gently at her mother's hand, eager to return to the simple pleasures of childhood that awaited her at home. As they walked slowly back toward their car, Mia paused, glancing back once more toward her brother's grave, a soft, contented smile touching her lips. "Thank you," she said quietly to Ethan, to Leo, to the strange, winding path that had brought them all together. "For what?" Ethan asked gently, though he understood the depth of gratitude behind her simple words. "For everything," Mia said. "For a promise made on a porch years before I ever met you. For choosing to keep that promise, even when it would have been easier to let it fade, forgotten, the way everyone assumed I would be. For loving me completely, exactly as I am, without ever asking me to be anything other than myself." Ethan pulled her gently into his arms, their daughter's small hand still clasped between them, and pressed a soft, tender kiss to the top of her head. "You never needed to thank me for that," he said quietly. "Loving you has been the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done. You gave me far more than I ever gave you, Mia. You gave me a reason to believe that even the deepest grief can lead, eventually, to the deepest joy." They stood together for a long moment in comfortable, contented silence, watching as their daughter wandered a few steps away, chasing a butterfly through the soft summer grass with the carefree joy of early childhood, entirely unaware of the profound history that had shaped the loving family surrounding her. That evening, after Lily had been put to bed, Ethan and Mia sat together on their back porch, watching the last light of the summer sunset fade slowly into the deepening blue of early night, a quiet ritual they had maintained together since the earliest days of their relationship. Do you ever think about how different things might have been, Mia asked softly, if you hadn't remembered that promise? If you'd simply let it fade the way I always expected everyone eventually would? Ethan considered the question thoughtfully before answering. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. I think about how close I came to forgetting, how easily that memory could have stayed buried under the weight of everyday life. But I also think that some things are simply meant to happen, meant to find their way to us eventually, even if the path leading there is difficult or uncertain. I used to believe that people only loved conditionally, Mia said quietly, resting her head against his shoulder as the stars began to emerge overhead. That love always came with expectations, with limits, with the constant fear that eventually I would become too much of a burden and be left behind. You taught me that isn't true, not with real love. You taught me plenty too, Ethan said gently, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and pulling her closer. You taught me what true resilience looks like, what quiet, unwavering strength really means. I've never admired anyone the way I admire you, Mia. Not just for surviving everything life put in front of you, but for choosing, again and again, to remain kind and open despite it all. Mia smiled softly, tilting her head up to meet his gaze, the same tired, sharp eyes he had first noticed at Leo's funeral now, filled with warmth, contentment, and the deep, settled peace of a woman who had finally found the unconditional love and belonging she had spent so many years believing she would never have. I love you, she said simply, the words carrying the full weight of everything they had built together over the past 5 years. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. I love you more than my own life, Ethan replied, his voice steady and certain, echoing sentiments he had felt building within him from nearly the very beginning of their unlikely, remarkable love story. I meant that the day I proposed, and I mean it just as deeply now, watching you sitting beside me, our daughter sleeping peacefully inside, our family finally whole and at peace after everything we've faced together. They sat together in comfortable, grateful silence as the stars fully emerged overhead, illuminating the peaceful summer night with a soft, gentle glow. Somewhere beyond the reach of either of them, in whatever quiet place the departed find peace, Leo Bennett's memory continued to watch over the family he had loved so deeply, the friend and the sister who had, against every obstacle placed in their path, found their way to each other exactly as he had always quietly hoped they might. What began as a single, quiet promise made on a porch years before, nearly forgotten amid the ordinary business of everyday life, had grown into a love story neither Ethan nor Mia could have anticipated, a story built on grief transformed into hope, rejection transformed into belonging, and loneliness transformed, finally and completely, into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the deep, unwavering devotion of two people who had chosen, again and again, to love each other more than life itself. And as the summer night deepened around them, wrapping their small, peaceful home in gentle darkness, Ethan and Mia remained together on their porch, exactly where they belonged, grateful beyond words for the unlikely, beautiful path that had led them to this moment, and ready together to face whatever quiet, ordinary joys and challenges still awaited them in the many years still to come. 10 years after the wedding, the house on the quiet street had grown fuller, busier, alive with the sounds of 2 children now instead of 1. Lily, no longer a small girl chasing butterflies through cemetery grass, was nearing her teenage years, tall and sharp-witted, with her mother's same careful, observant eyes. Her younger brother, Sam, had arrived 3 years after her, a cheerful, energetic boy who filled the house with a different kind of noise entirely. Constant motion, constant questions, constant laughter. Mia had changed too, though the changes were quieter, harder to name than the simple passage of years might suggest. She no longer carried herself like someone bracing for disappointment. She had grown into her place within the Bennett family so completely that newer, younger relatives sometimes forgot she had ever been treated as anything other than fully, unquestionably belonging. She had become, in fact, something of an anchor for the family herself, the person younger cousins came to when they needed someone who would listen without judgment, who understood more deeply than most what it meant to feel unseen. It was this quality in her that led, one autumn afternoon, to an unexpected visitor at their front door. The young woman standing on the porch could not have been older than 20, dressed plainly, her posture carrying the same guarded, defensive tension Mia remembered intimately from her own younger years. She introduced herself as Ivy, a distant cousin on Leo's father's side, someone Mia had heard mentioned only briefly at family gatherings, always in hushed, uncomfortable tones. "I hope this isn't strange," Ivy said, twisting her hands nervously in front of her. "Grace gave me your address. She said, if anyone in this family would understand what I'm going through, it would be you." Mia invited her inside without hesitation, settling her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, recognizing in the young woman's careful, guarded posture an echo of her own past that she could not ignore. Ivy's story, once she found the courage to share it, carried familiar threads. A complicated family situation, a parent's mistake that had left her labeled and judged before she had ever had the chance to be truly known. A family that preferred to keep her at a careful distance, uncomfortable with the complications her presence represented. A childhood spent feeling like an unwelcome footnote in a story that should have included her fully. "I don't know why I came here," Ivy admitted, staring down into her untouched tea. "I suppose I just wanted to talk to someone who might actually understand, instead of pretending everything is fine or telling me I'm overreacting." Mia listened carefully, recognizing in Ivy's words the same painful isolation she herself had carried for so many years, the particular loneliness of being present but unwanted, included in name only. When Ivy finished speaking, Mia reached across the table and took her hand, a small, simple gesture that carried enormous weight. "I understand more than you probably realize," Mia said gently. "I spent most of my life feeling exactly the way you're describing. Forgotten, blamed for circumstances I never chose, treated as though my existence was something to be quietly managed rather than genuinely embraced." Ivy looked up, surprised. "But everyone talks about you and Ethan like you're the perfect family, like none of that ever happened." "It happened," Mia said. "For a very long time, longer than I'd like to admit. Things changed, but not overnight and not without a lot of difficult conversations and a lot of people choosing, deliberately, to do better. That kind of change doesn't happen on its own. It happens because someone decides the old way of doing things isn't good enough anymore, and they're willing to keep insisting on that, even when it's uncomfortable." "How did it start?" Ivy asked. "The change, I mean." Mia smiled softly, thinking back over the years to a cold cemetery morning, to a stranger who had crossed wet grass to introduce himself simply because he refused to let her stand alone. "Someone noticed me," she said. "Really noticed me, not just acknowledged that I existed, but actually saw me, and refused to accept that I deserved to be treated as less than anyone else in this family. It only took one person in the beginning, but that one person made all the difference." From the next room the sound of Ethan's voice drifted through, gently scolding Sam for some minor mischief, followed by Lily's easy, teasing laughter. Ivy glanced toward the sound, then back at Mia, something shifting in her expression, a small, cautious flicker of hope. "Can I ask you something?" Ivy said. "Do you think it's possible for things to actually get better, for a family to really change, not just pretend to?" "I know it's possible," Mia said firmly. "I'm living proof of it. It takes patience. It takes people being willing to have hard conversations, and it takes some people finally admitting they were wrong, which isn't easy for anyone. But it's possible. I promise you it's possible." They talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, long after the tea had gone cold, Mia sharing pieces of her own difficult history with a young woman who desperately needed to hear that her pain was neither imagined nor permanent. By the time Ivy finally rose to leave, her posture had shifted subtly, her guarded defensiveness softened by the simple, powerful experience of being truly heard. "Thank you," Ivy said at the door, her voice thick with unexpected emotion. "I don't think anyone has ever talked to me like that before, like what I'm feeling actually matters." "It matters," Mia said firmly. "You matter, Ivy. Don't let anyone, family included, convince you otherwise. And please don't be a stranger. You're welcome here anytime." After Ivy left, Mia stood for a long moment on the porch, watching the young woman's car pull away down the quiet street, her heart full of a complicated mixture of old sorrow and new purpose. Ethan joined her a few minutes later, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, sensing the weight of the conversation that had just taken place. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. "It will be," Mia said, leaning back into his familiar, steady embrace. "I just met someone who reminded me a lot of myself a long time ago. I think I might have actually helped her, even just a little." "You more than helped her," Ethan said. "I heard some of what you said from the other room. You gave her exactly what she needed. The same thing I tried to give you all those years ago." Mia turned in his arms to face him, studying his familiar, kind face with the same deep, settled love that had grown steadily over more than a decade together. "Do you ever think about how strange it is," she said softly, "that the worst day of my life led to all of this? Not just us, not just our family, but the chance to help someone else who's struggling with the exact same pain I used to carry." "I think," Ethan said, echoing words he had spoken to her years earlier by the lake, "that sometimes our hardest moments end up leading us exactly where we're meant to be, even when we can't see it clearly at the time. I think Leo would be proud, watching you do for Ivy exactly what you needed someone to do for you, all those years ago." Mia smiled, tears gathering softly at the corners of her eyes, though these carried none of the old sorrow, only quiet, grateful joy. "I think he would be too," she said. That evening, after the children had finally settled into bed and the house had grown quiet around them, Ethan and Mia sat together once more on their familiar back porch, the same simple ritual they had maintained faithfully for over a decade, watching the stars slowly emerge over their peaceful, ordinary street. "I keep thinking about something you said a long time ago," Ethan said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "About how you never expected any of this. The family, the wedding, the children, all of it." "I remember," Mia said softly. "I think about that a lot," Ethan continued. "How close everything came to never happening. If Leo hadn't said those words to me on my porch, years before either of us understood their significance. If I hadn't remembered them at exactly the right moment. If you decided I wasn't worth trusting, after a lifetime of people proving that trust was dangerous." "But none of that happened," Mia said, reaching for his hand in the quiet darkness. "You remembered. You showed up again and again exactly when I needed you to, and I decided, despite everything I'd learned to fear, that you were worth trusting after all. I'm grateful every single day that you made that choice," Ethan said, his voice thick with quiet, enduring emotion. "I love you, Mia. As much today as I did the day I proposed, maybe even more, now that I've watched you grow into everything you've become." Mia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the stars continue their slow, steady emergence overhead, feeling the same deep, settled peace that had become the quiet foundation of her entire life. "I love you too," she said softly. "More than I ever imagined I could love anyone." They sat together in comfortable, contented silence, two people whose unlikely love story had begun in grief and grown, steadily and faithfully, into a life filled with warmth, belonging, and quiet, unwavering devotion. A devotion that continued to ripple outward, touching not only their own family, but the lives of others still learning, slowly and painfully, that they too deserved to be truly seen, truly valued, and truly, unconditionally loved.